ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that there are moments in Port Charles when the truth does not arrive like a clean confession or a neatly opened file. It arrives like a wound splitting open in public, forcing everyone nearby to see how much pain has been festering beneath the skin. The revelation of the connection between Willow, Deliah, and Sidwell carries exactly that kind of violence. It is not simply a surprise about blood or lineage. It is the kind of truth that rearranges the emotional map of several lives at once, exposing hidden motives, reviving buried grief, and turning what once looked like a hopeful fight for a child's future into a battlefield drenched in fear, pride, and desperation. The cruelest part is that the child at the center of it all, little Phoebe, has become more than a baby in need of protection. She has become a symbol of redemption for some, a final claim of blood for others, and an instrument of power for the one person in Port Charles who knows exactly how to weaponize other people's heartbreak. For Brooklyn and Chase, the hope of building a future around Phoebe had never been simple. Nothing in their lives ever is. Their love has survived misunderstandings, pride, old scars, and the endless pressure of living in a city where private pain rarely remains private for long. Yet the possibility of giving Phoebe stability had begun to feel like something sacred, almost like fate offering them one fragile piece of peace after so much emotional turbulence. It was not just about becoming guardians. It was about becoming the kind of family both of them had spent so much time trying to define for themselves. Brooklyn, who has always lived with one foot in the Quartermain storm and the other in her own fierce need to protect what she loves, saw in Phoebe a chance to pour all her instinct, all her stubborn loyalty, into something pure. Chase, who has spent so much of his life trying to do the right thing even when it cost him dearly, saw in that little girl not only innocence but purpose. Together they were not chasing an idealized dream. They were reaching for something solid, something worth fighting for, something that might finally quiet the ache that so often lingers after love survives too many tests. But hope in Port Charles is dangerous precisely because it can be seen, measured, and destroyed. The moment Willow's knowledge about Deliah and Sidwell became public, the entire emotional balance shifted. What had looked like a custody path became a legal and moral nightmare. What had felt like a story about care and devotion became tangled in bloodlines, inheritance of pain, and the brutal logic of a man like Sidwell. If Sidwell is indeed Phoebe's last living blood connection through Deliah, then this is no longer just a matter of who can raise a child with tenderness. It becomes a contest between love earned and blood claimed, between a home built by choice and a legacy asserted by force. In a city that has always been obsessed with who belongs to whom, that distinction matters more than people want to admit. Willow stands in the center of this revelation like someone who has opened a door and found not justice on the other side, but chaos. There is something deeply unsettling about the way she moves through this crisis, because her involvement is not passive. She is not merely a witness to the fallout. She is using what she knows, shaping the emotional temperature of the conflict, and turning private knowledge into leverage. That is where the true danger begins. Willow has always been a character whose gentleness can make people underestimate the steel underneath. She does not always explode. She calculates, she absorbs, she waits. And when she decides that she has been wronged or cornered, her choices can come from a place so wounded that they acquire a frightening moral certainty. In this situation, she is not acting like someone who simply wants truth to be acknowledged. She is acting like someone who has discovered that truth can be used as a blade. That makes her role devastatingly complex. She may tell herself that she is exposing the connection between Deliah and Sidwell because Phoebe deserves honesty, because decisions of this scale should not be built on concealment, because blood ties matter whether people like it or not. On the surface, those arguments hold weight, but underneath them is something darker and more emotional. Willow is not moving in a vacuum. She is moving with the accumulated hurt of a woman who has watched families fracture, loyalties shift, and people she once trusted become strangers under pressure. She understands the damage that secrets can do. Yet instead of breaking the cycle cleanly, she begins to repeat it in another form, turning revelation into attack. There is a difference between telling the truth and deploying the truth with intent to destabilize. Willow, whether she admits it or not, has crossed that line. That is why Brooklyn's rage in this story matters so much. Her anger is not the shallow fury of a woman who feels entitled to a child. It is the fury of someone who sees the emotional cruelty of what is happening in real time. She can sense that Phoebe is being transformed from a vulnerable child into a prize, in a legal and emotional war. Brooklyn has always understood the ugliness of power games because she grew up surrounded by them. She knows what happens when adults tell themselves they are acting out of duty while really fighting out their own grievances through someone weaker. Watching Willow push this revelation forward would feel, to Brooklyn, like a betrayal of everything that ought to matter most. Not because facts should stay hidden, but because the timing, the force, and the intent behind their exposure can break the very child everyone claims to care about. Chase's pain runs quieter, but it cuts just as deeply. He is the kind of man who believes systems can still work if honest people stand inside them long enough. That belief is part of his strength and part of his tragedy. In a conflict like this, he would want to believe that the court will see what matters, that love and stability will outweigh the shadow of biological connection, that a child's welfare can still mean more than the ego of a dangerous man. But deep down, Chase knows Port Charles does not always reward decency. He knows that once someone like Sidwell smells a legal opening, compassion becomes almost irrelevant. The law can become a stage, and men like Sidwell love stages because they know how to weaponize narrative, posture, and fear. Chase would be forced to confront a brutal possibility that doing everything right may still not protect Phoebe from being dragged into a nightmare. And Sidwell, more than anyone, embodies the darkness at the heart of this revelation. A man like him does not suddenly become tender because fatherhood has been exposed. He becomes possessive. He becomes strategic. He becomes dangerous in a new direction. If Deliah was truly his daughter, then Phoebe is not just family in any ordinary emotional sense. She becomes his final thread to whatever remains of his bloodline, his legacy, his name, his control. Whether his interest comes from genuine buried grief, warped pride, or the obsession of a man who cannot bear to lose what he believes belongs to him, the outcome is the same. He will not see Phoebe as a child first. He will see her as a claim. That is what makes his involvement terrifying. He does not have to love like Brooklyn and Chase love in order to fight harder than they do. In fact, his lack of tenderness may make him more ruthless, because he is liberated from the hesitation that real love creates. There is also something especially chilling about the possibility that Sidwell may frame his battle as noble. Men like him rarely present themselves as villains in their own stories. He could speak the language of family, responsibility, and blood. He could present himself as the last rightful guardian of a child linked to unbearable loss. He could even wrap his ambitions in grief, invoking Deliah as though reclaiming Phoebe were a tribute to the dead rather than a conquest over the living. That is what would make the conflict so poisonous. Brooklyn and Chase would not just be fighting a cruel man. They would be fighting a man clever enough to dress cruelty in the language of kinship. Willow's role in enabling that possibility is what gives this story its deepest emotional fracture. Once Sidwell steps forward, Willow cannot pretend she merely told the truth and stepped aside. She would have helped create the conditions for a war whose consequences she may not be able to control. That burden would begin to change her, perhaps not immediately, but steadily. She would start to see the fear in the people around Phoebe. She would see Brooklyn's protective fury harden into distrust. She would see Chase's disappointment, which is often more painful than anger because it comes from a place of broken faith. She would realize that once truth has been turned into a weapon, it does not stay obedient to the hand that first lifted it. It strikes outward, it expands, it humiliates, it devours innocence on the way. The tragedy is that Willow may believe she is correcting an imbalance. She may look at Brooklyn and Chase and see privilege, support, respectability, the kind of image that courts find comforting. She may convince herself that someone needed to disrupt the simplicity of their claim, that someone needed to remind Port Charles that the story was never that clean. And in one sense, she would be right. Human lives are never clean. Children often come into the world carrying the unresolved sins and hidden loves of the adults around them. But the moral force of that truth collapses when it becomes an excuse to unleash someone like Sidwell into a child's future. That is the emotional contradiction at the center of Willow's actions. She may want justice, but she is moving in a way that invites devastation. Phoebe herself becomes the silent center of everyone's projections. For Brooklyn, she represents a family chosen with full heart and hard-earned devotion. For Chase, she represents a chance to protect without compromise. For Willow, she becomes the axis around which hidden truth can no longer be denied. For Sidwell, she becomes a final possession dressed up as a legacy. That is what makes the situation unbearable. No one is looking at Phoebe without seeing themselves reflected back in some form. Their grief, their hope, their entitlement, their regret, their loneliness, their hunger to matter. A child that young cannot speak, yet everyone has begun speaking through her. That is often the darkest thing adults do in Port Charles. They call it love while forcing a child to carry meanings she never asked to hold. Brooklyn's greatest strength in this fight would be that her protectiveness is visceral and unapologetic. She would not approach this as an abstract legal chess game. She would feel every move in her body. Every delay would feel like danger. Every court filing would feel like an invasion. Every rumor about Sidwell's next move would feel like a hand reaching toward Phoebe's future. That emotional intensity could make her formidable, but it could also make her vulnerable. Brooklyn is at her best when she fights for someone she loves, yet that same fierce instinct can tempt her into emotional missteps, into saying too much, pushing too hard, letting anger show where calm might be more strategic. The more she senses that Willow set this storm in motion, the more personal the conflict becomes. And once Brooklyn takes something personally, she rarely backs down. She burns hotter. She speaks sharper. She becomes impossible to intimidate, but sometimes also impossible to slow down. Chase would be the one trying to hold that fire in a shape the world can respect. He would stand beside her not because he feels less deeply, but because his love expresses itself through steadiness. He would become the moral backbone of their fight, the person reminding Brooklyn that panic is exactly what men like Sidwell exploit. Yet even he would begin to fray. There is only so long a good man can remain composed while watching a child's safety become negotiable. Only so long he can listen to biological claims being treated as though they automatically outweigh daily love, sacrifice, and emotional security. The pressure would force him to confront an old terror, that no matter how honorable he is, he may not be enough to stop the ugliness of the world from touching what he loves. That fear is what gives the story its most human ache. Because beneath the legal strategy, beneath Willow's maneuvering, beneath Sidwell's looming threat, this is ultimately about whether goodness has enough force to stand against obsession. Port Charles is full of characters who have learned to manipulate chaos better than they can heal from it. Brooklyn and Chase, for all their flaws, would be trying to do something fundamentally simple and decent, give a child safety. And yet even that becomes vulnerable to the gravitational pull of old sins, hidden fathers, dangerous bloodlines, and the seductive power of revelation. It is almost unbearable because it feels so unfair. The people willing to love Phoebe most cleanly may be the very people forced to prove they deserve her against those who see her as an extension of their own damage. Sidwell's looming war would not only threaten custody, it would expose every weak seam in the people fighting him. He would likely test Brooklyn and Chase emotionally before he ever struck legally. He would want them off balance. He would want fear inside their home. He would want Willow convinced she had done the right thing until it was too late to pull back. The cruelty of a man like Sidwell is not just in what he takes. It is in how he makes others participate in the destruction before they realize what they have enabled. That is why his connection to Deliah changes everything. It hands him not only a claim, but a story. And stories in Port Charles can be more dangerous than guns because they give monsters a respectable mask. By the time the full emotional consequences begin to settle, everyone would be altered. Brooklyn would become harder, more defiant, less willing to trust the supposed neutrality of anyone outside her immediate circle. Chase would be forced into a more ruthless understanding of what protection sometimes requires. Willow would face the unbearable knowledge that truth, once weaponized, can injure the innocent just as efficiently as a lie. And Sidwell, if allowed even one foothold, would prove that blood can become the most terrifying excuse of all when it lands in the hands of a man who values possession over love. That is why this story hits with such force. It is not merely shocking that Sidwell could be Deliah's father, or that this revelation could disrupt Brooklyn and Chase's attempt to secure custody of Phoebe. The real shock is what the revelation uncovers about everyone involved. It shows how quickly tenderness can be surrounded by predators. It shows how easily truth can be corrupted by motive. It shows that family, in a place like Port Charles, is never just about affection. It is about history, leverage, identity, power, and the unresolved hunger to claim what has been lost. Phoebe becomes the final innocent caught in that machinery, and the adults around her must decide whether they truly love her enough to stop making her the battlefield for their own unfinished wars. If there is any hope inside a story this dark, it rests in whether Brook, Lynn, and Chase can hold on to the meaning of what they are fighting for without becoming consumed by the methods of the people they oppose. That is the real emotional test. Not simply whether they can win custody, but whether they can remain the kind of home Phoebe deserves while the world around them grows uglier. Because Sidwell may know how to claim blood, and Willow may know how to unleash a devastating truth, but neither of those things is the same as building safety with your own hands, day after day, in the face of fear. And perhaps that is the final heartbreaking beauty of this conflict. In a city where so many people confuse ownership with love, Brook, Lynn, and Chase may be the only ones who understand that a child is not the last piece of someone's legacy. A child is a life, trembling and unwritten, and whoever fights for her must decide whether they are protecting her future or merely trying to rewrite their own past through her.